The government is being rocked by demands that Boris Johnson's chief advisor Dominic Cummings resigns for breaking the lockdown rules which he himself helped to create. So should he go? And what does this story tell us about Britain's political and media class? On March the 27th, when news first broke of Boris Johnson testing positive for coronavirus, Dominic Cummings was filmed running out of Downing Street. 4 days later, on the 31st of March, police were informed that Dominic Cummings had been spotted 260 miles away, in the garden of his parents' Durham home. This was in the middle of the lockdown, when the British public had been told, in no uncertain terms, to
stay at home, protect our NHS and save lives.
And the story gets worse. Not only did Dominic Cummings travel 264 miles in the middle of a lockdown, he did so when his wife had coronavirus symptoms and when he was most likely also suffering from COVID-19.
Move out the way.
This means he was in that group of people who should have been taking self-isolating most seriously, not leaving the house for any reason whatsoever. Yet Dominic Cummings felt it appropriate to spend about 4.5 hours hurtling down the M1 towards Durham, and we can presume it's likely he stopped at least one petrol station along the way. This then seems like a clear-cut case of coronavirus rule breaking, and quite possibly one that had serious implications for public health. There's also precedent for what should happen in situations like this. When Scotland's chief medical officer was caught breaking the lockdown, she was forced to resign, as was Neil Ferguson, a high-profile scientist who sits on SAGE. Here's Health Secretary Matt Hancock on the Ferguson case.
As a government minister, I'm not allowed to get involved in the operational decisions of police matters, but I think he took the right decision to resign.
Yet, surprise, surprise, the government are not quite so keen to throw Boris Johnson's key advisor under the bus. We discovered the government's line on the revelations when Laura Kuenssberg publicly replied to the journalist who had first broken the story. Kuenssberg wrote, "Source says his trip was within guidelines as Cummings went to stay with his parents so they could help with childcare while he and his wife were ill. They insist no breach of lockdown." 12 hours later, it was updated to suggest it was in fact Dominic Cummings' sister who had offered to help. Finally, the official Downing Street statement was released, saying, owing to his wife being infected with suspected coronavirus and the high likelihood that he himself would become unwell, it was essential for Dominic Cummings to ensure his young child could be properly cared for. At no stage was he or his family spoken to by the police about this matter, as is being reported. His actions were in line with coronavirus guidelines. Mr. Cummings believes he behaved reasonably and legally. Let's put aside the government contradicting the Durham police for one moment and focus on two claims: that Dominic Cummings' actions were reasonable and within the government guidelines. On the latter, we can take a look at the NHS website. Here it seems clear. If you or someone you live with have symptoms of coronavirus, do not leave your home for any reason. There's no ifs or buts there. But supporters of Cummings have pointed to this clause on a separate government website about self-isolating. Here it says, if you are living with children, keep following this advice to the best of your ability. However, we are aware that not all these measures will be possible. What we have seen so far is that children with coronavirus appear to be less severely affected. It is nevertheless important to do your best to follow this guidance. Given what's on the rest of the page, the most natural reading of this statement is that people have permission to bend the rules when it comes to social distancing within their own home if they live with children. Not permission to leave the home altogether. Why else would the website highlight the low risk to children? But even if we do take the liberal reading, is it really credible to suggest that driving 270 miles to Durham with coronavirus is following these rules to the best of one's ability? If Cummings was well enough to drive, he was well enough to look after his child. If he was worried about childcare, if he and his wife were to deteriorate, surely there would have been someone closer to home, perhaps London-based, who could have stepped in that unlikely event. Like, perhaps, his wife's brother, who happens to live in London, or his aide and close friend, who lives 2 streets away. In short, the whole thing stinks. So what are the political implications? There are suggestions the government has known about this for weeks and kept it quiet. That raises questions about honesty. What's more, the government is now defending someone for the same breach of rules that led them to argue that other senior figures should resign. That suggests hypocrisy. However, what's most worrying here is the government's willingness to stretch the meaning of the lockdown rules purely to protect one of their own. Boris Johnson hasn't only refused to fire Dominic Cummings, he's gone so far as to suggest he never broke the rules. That implicitly gives permission and indeed encourages people to take actions which, by any ordinary understanding of the rules, are completely against guidelines. That's a threat to public health.
The PM provides Mr. Cummings with his full support, and Mr. Cummings has provided a full statement.
Finally, what does this tell us about our country's press, and in particular, the BBC? When the Telegraph revealed Neil Ferguson had broken the lockdown, the BBC political editor responded like this, saying simply, "That's a hell of a story." But when the Mirror and Guardian broke the news about Cummings, Laura Kuenssberg's first response was to provide an anonymously briefed government rebuttal, before tweeting a different account the following morning, again from anonymous sources. Finally, in response to another journalist suggesting possible inconsistencies in the stories that Laura Kuenssberg had broadcast, she said simply, "Yup, lots of questions and opposition parties certainly won't rest till they are answered." Yet surely it should be the job of political editors to ask those questions and yes, find out the answers, not just to wait for opposition politicians to make those demands. Has British political journalism really just become a race to see who can tweet out texts from politicians with no regard as to whether they are true or false? I mean, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. In short, this story tells us everything that's wrong with the British establishment. We have political leaders who think there's one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. They also think it's reasonable to lie to protect their own, even if it threatens public health. Finally, it shows why our political elites feel able to get away with this. When we have the country's most senior political journalist acting as a de facto government press officer, is it any surprise our government don't see any cost to hypocrisy, misinformation, and a cavalier attitude to matters of life and death?
Andy, come back.